Hello and welcome to Inflection Point Conversations. I'm Michelle Obeda, an art director and 3D artist. In this podcast series, I'll be interviewing experts in the fields of art, architecture, and visualization. Together, we'll take a deep dive into the disruptive topics that have reached an inflection point in our industry. If you're enjoying this podcast, please take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe, comment, and give feedback. I'd love to reach more people and grow this amazing community. Today, I'm talking with Anthony Koithra. Anthony is an indie animated filmmaker, equal parts writer, director, animator, and technical artist. He started out in banking and had a successful 20-year career in business consulting. He was a managing director and partner at the Boston Consulting Group and part of the founding team of the BCG Digital Ventures. In 2020, at the age of 42, Anthony decided to drastically shift his career into the world of animation and filmmaking. He works primarily in Unreal Engine, using the real-time animation environment to tell sci-fi and fantasy stories from an immigrant perspective. He is particularly interested in stylized characters and NPR shaders, and he's an Epic Games Unreal Fellow. Anthony also advises startups in the media and tech spaces and teaches storytelling at corporate and educational institutions like NYU and Columbia. Welcome, Anthony.
Michelle, so nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. So you, like many other friends of the pod, I've met through 3DNY meetup, but other meetups as well through Unreal Engine and stuff. I feel like we've been in like similar rooms and I've been
Sort of
fascinated by
parallel
what you
circles.
do.
Yeah,
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 yeah.
that's right.
But once I learned a little bit more about what you do, I feel like I have a million questions and excited to ask you. I mean, for anyone who hasn't seen your animations, I'm going to put some links up, but they're like amazing and actually really inspiring creatively.
That's very nice of you to say about my very weird films.
Yeah, I mean, the best ones are weird. That's the point.
Thanks. Yeah, when I try to explain to people from my sort of previous lives, is like, yeah, I made this thing that mashes up Top Gun and Star Wars. People are like, what are you doing with your life exactly? I'm like, I'm just having a really good time, is what I'm doing.
Yeah. Also, it's one of those things that once someone sees it, they understand it completely. I feel like,
Yeah,
oh, how do those two
yeah,
things go together? Yeah, I can see it.
right.
So you had a career about 20 years in business consulting.
Yes,
So,
very old. Yeah.
well, so were you always interested in animation, or when did you get interested?
Yeah, forever. I mean, I've always been interested in film, storytelling in general, animation in particular, and it's been one of those things that you kind of follow and consume media, but I've always been a maker of various different things, and it's one of the things I always wanted to make. I always wanted to animate, and I tried doing 3D type stuff in nights and weekends, but you know, you've been in the 3D space for a while. Like that learning curve is not a nights and weekends thing. Like it is a
Yeah, yeah,
to do it properly and to learn it properly, it takes pretty sustained effort over a long period of time. And for animation in particular, there's a steep technical learning curve, but there's also a really steep artistic learning curve, both
yeah,
of which I think I'm sort of at the bottom of. I'm like learning in the early stages of learning, but it's incredibly fun. And so it's something I had always wanted to do, but you know, economic realities prevail. Like you do a job that pays the bills and that kind of thing. And so I made a lot of responsible choices based largely on economics for the earlier part of my career. And then when I got to the point where, where had a little bit of flexibility and I could make choices based more on what I was really passionate about, I switched out and stopped.
yeah, yeah. And that, I mean, I find that really inspiring when people shift their careers. Was there, especially later in life, because it's sort of like celebrating the enjoyment of what you want to do.
Yeah.
Did you feel like, okay, I'm at a point when now I just want to do something that I really love?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not like I hated my job before or anything like that. It was an exciting company. I was part of the founding team. We helped set it up. I was able to like influence it in a lot of ways to shape it to be something I was excited about doing on a day-to-day basis. But it wasn't the thing. It wasn't
Yeah.
the thing. There was always this like I really would love to be doing it. And it was so radically different from what I was doing on a day-to-day
Yeah.
basis the only through line really being storytelling and narrative, right? Like that. But it was just so radically different and required, like I was saying, this big kind of technical learning curve. But my partner, Laura, who's always been incredibly supportive of all of my weird choices, she pushed me consistently to be like, if this is something you're excited about, and she's like, I've seen you light up when you talk about it, like you should go and try and do it. And like the most the kind of there's the career version of it, right? Like of making films and doing it as a job, which I don't really feel like I'm doing necessarily. Like I'm not super interested in going and working at a big studio to make films because
Yep.
I don't think a big studio would necessarily want to make the kinds of things that I'm making.
Yeah.
But I like the most pretentious way of describing what I'm doing is as like a very indulgent art practice, kind of.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's sort of what I'm doing. Like the objective is to get the stuff that I'm first to make good stuff, and then to get the stuff that I make into festivals that I respect and that kind of thing. But like really, the end objective is to make good art.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you're describing sounds very similar to other kinds of art that I guess when you decide to essentially quit your day job, and dive, headfirst into this new career, I at first it's unlikely to make you money for a while, right? So
Sure.
like you're kind of aware of that. Like, did you also, you talked about the steep learning curve. Did you also kind of factor in that time? Like, I'm going to need a bit of time before I'm actually going to be
Yeah,
good
a little
enough.
bit, a
Yeah.
little bit. I sort of, I'm a very sort of, I guess output oriented is one phrase for it, but like I like to ship stuff, like get stuff done and finish it and that
Yep.
kind of thing. And I was very aware that the timelines on these projects are long. Like it takes a long time to make some of these things, and even
Mm-hmm.
longer time when you don't really know what you're doing, when you're figuring stuff out as you go along. And so I sort of gave myself the first 2 years, which ended in April of this year, the first 2 years after I quit, to more just experiment and learn and invest in that kind of thing versus having to put stuff out. So the things that I have put out, like Rogue Squadron and the Avengers thing, and all that stuff, those were sort of proofs of concept. Like more just
Mm-hmm.
tests of what felt like the workflow. Just because I've always found like that is the fastest way of learning something. You like figure out a project and then learn all the things you need to execute on that project.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm currently working on like my first original film, and so this is
Mm-hmm.
something that I wrote and scripted and storyboarded and
Nice.
and everything else. And so that's about 2/3 of the way through. As with everything that I've done, it's taken a lot longer than I expected, and
Mm-hmm.
so every form of Excel planning chart that I have, and I still do have lots of Excel planning charts, uh, is is like completely blown out of any sort of adherence at this point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Is
But
it like
but
a full feature or a short film?
no. I like as a solo animator, like making a feature is super unrealistic. This is a
Sure.
6 to 7 minute short film. Uh,
Amazing. Yeah.
so it's like 90 something shots, which is too many shots. But it's
Yeah.
it's a lot.
That's so exciting. I love that you said you're output orientated. I find that actually probably, like, do you think that's quite important for artists? Because many artists aren't output orientated and then maybe get stuck and frustrated with not
Yeah.
finishing things.
Yeah, this is something I struggle with a little bit, and Laura and I talk about it a lot. It I even struggle with calling myself an artist sometimes just because I haven't really been one for a very long time. I think I've been one
Well,
deep inside my brain, and I'm only really
mm,
allowing myself to be one now.
yeah.
And so I bring actually certain things from my previous career to this that I think I may not have had if I had started out being an artist. And that
Mm-hmm.
it's, like in consulting, incredibly tight timelines to do very large amounts of work. It
Mm-hmm.
requires a ruthless focus, ruthless prioritization, planning to a certain extent, but being comfortable with those plans changing, understanding when the end objective is not being met, and making fundamental changes to your approach and everything else based on that. And so I think I bring a little bit of that to this. And what I try to like prevent happening. What I try to let not happen is for that to overly influence the end art, like the end art output.
Mhm.
Right? Like I want that to be of a high degree of quality,
Mhm.
but I want it to happen within a realistic time frame. And I want there to be actually, I want to actually complete the project. And
Yeah.
so, while the thing I'm doing right now has taken almost three times as long as I had originally planned for it to take, I'm going to be happy with the way that it comes out. Like,
Yeah.
like for this, using this short film as an example, I made about 80% of it. And then I realized the kind of core character models for the protagonist and antagonist really weren't working. Like the character you're supposed to be sympathetic for was not cute enough and not sympathetic enough, and the villain
Mm.
was not scary enough. And
Was
so
this like visually, or do you mean in the script?
visually, because the
Mm.
script, it's no dialogue, it's all like kind of sounds and foley and grunts and things like that. It's the kind of rough story is like it's a factory worker, and it's only a single human character, and all the other characters are industrial robots in a factory. He treats them very badly, cranks them up to kind of a capacity that they shouldn't be. They rebel, form into a giant robot, and then beat the crap out of him. And so it's a not subtle metaphor for the relationship between labor and management, but
Mhm.
but it's but again, like those two characters, like the robots and the engineer, were just one wasn't sympathetic enough, and the other was not scary
Whoa.
enough. And so I completely, the environment stayed the same, but like I completely redesigned both characters and started from scratch. And so
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons that it's taking so long. But again, not having like a built-in firm deadline helps me with that.
Yeah.
And then having complete control over the output helps me with that. But
Yeah.
my guiding kind of North Star is like, am I going to be proud of it? Am I going to
Yeah.
be with it? And that's a kind of sliding scale as you're learning, because your standards rise as you
Yeah.
learn more. And so, again, I'm trying to find that balance between artistic fulfillment, but delivering the project,
Yeah. Yeah. And I can see how that takes some discipline, self-discipline.
Yeah.
So you grew up in India, and then you lived in, let's say, Singapore, Japan, New York, Dubai, LA, and now you're back in New York.
That's right. I've moved
Um,
around a lot. Yeah.
you've moved around a lot. Like, do you think moving and living in different countries has informed your storytelling?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think all of your life's experiences tend to inform the way you come at storytelling. But I think one of the biggest things that living in so many different places and getting to know so many people, different kinds of people so well, means that you constantly become sorry, my automatic thing is to take somebody else's perspective. It's like, how are they thinking about this that's different from the way I think about it? That's
Hmm.
Bagel, by the way. He
Hi,
might
Bagel.
from time to time. But yeah, I think I automatically, because I've lived in places where a lot of the folks around have completely different backgrounds to me and think about things very differently, I'm asking myself the question of like, how would they think about this? How would they read this situation, and how would that
Mm.
work? Which, narrative and storytelling is an empathy engine, right? Like
Yep.
a well-told story drives empathy for that character. It makes the audience see the world through that character's eyes. And so, having tried my best to see the world through a lot of different kinds of people's eyes, I think that's made me a better storyteller.
Yeah. And did you find yourself sort of asking these questions when you were living in these different countries,
Yeah.
like constantly, like, I wonder how they see this thing that I see differently, for
Yeah,
example?
absolutely. Because you bring your own cultural baggage of all kinds and
Mhm.
to any situation, and when you're living and working in a place, and kind of somebody has a radically different opinion or a different take from you on something, you're like, well, that person's wrong, and then you're like, well, why did
Mm.
they seem very convinced that they're correct? So why might that be? And that forces you to question a lot of your own assumptions, and you kind of, you learn that narratives are very rarely black and white. And
No.
so if you want to tell a story that feels lifelike or feels
Yeah.
true to life, you can't tell black and white stories.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So you teach about storytelling. You have a lecture series about storytelling that you've given at NYU and Columbia and other business places. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, it started out as sort of a way of like bringing some of my interests together. So because of consumed so many films and books and things like that, like there's structure and there are rules and there are frameworks that exist in well-told stories, right? There's a reason that certain kinds of formulae for like the
Mm.
formulaic book or movie, there's a reason that certain formulae work.
Yeah.
And that's true for, the PowerPoint deck as well, and and so for the business, I did this for a business school class at NYU. I went to NYU for business school. I did this for a class there.
Mm.
Actually, that was so Laura, my wife, was teaching a course, a strategy course there. And she was like, can you come in and tell them how to make a PowerPoint deck that doesn't suck? and so, and
Good
so
skill.
and so having some experience in the field, I kind of did that. So I made like connections between film structures, which everybody understands. Everyone understands sort of rough three acts. A protagonist has to have an arc. There's like rising action, how a climax works, like the denouement, the end of that, like all of that kind of stuff, and then relating that to your bog standard corporate presentation and how that works and how you can elevate something like that by paying attention to the audience the way a filmmaker pays attention to their audience.
Mm.
And that involves, understanding who they are, developing a level of empathy for that audience, pacing your story correctly, giving them the right balance of information and insight, like doling out the kind of components of the story and the excitement and so on.
Mm.
And then how you tell a story with images, right? So the visual component of PowerPoint slides are often heavily ignored. And so kind of tying all of those things together into how do you think about a presentation that you have to give, whether you're using slides or not, but how do you think about a presentation in terms of you're really telling a story, and that story
Mm.
has a purpose, right? It has to achieve something. And so how do you do that effectively? And so I do I do a lecture for that's more related to like business and strategy, which I've done for the business schools, and then some architecture professors at Columbia asked me to do something similar, but for architecture students at
Okay.
GSAT, mainly because I think a lot of architecture students are incredibly focused on the design and the functionality of what they're doing, but telling the story of why that design works in that way and
Mm.
what its purpose is. That's a skill that's often sort of underinvested in. And so I developed like a lecture series about, yeah, essentially environmental storytelling. So it's
Mm.
how do you tell a story about what's happening through the environment itself,
Mhm.
signposting various things, both for kind of spatial awareness, but also the narrative of the humans that will occupy that space, or like how it works and what that society is like, and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's been very fun. I did a version of that for 3D NY.
Yeah, yeah, you did, and it was fascinating. And is this lecture series available to anyone online, or is it something that you have to be lucky enough to to be in the
Yeah,
room
sorry, I
for?
haven't recorded it and put it online. No, I've been
Fair.
doing it as a sort of one-off thing
Mm.
whenever people brought me in to do it. It's been, yeah, educational institutions mostly, and then there have actually been a few corporates that have had me come in and do it for kind of senior leaders who are giving presentations, often in like a sales
Mm.
context, professional services firms, that kind of thing, where you're kind of trying to pitch, you're like pitching a future vision, and to make
Yeah.
the story compelling, there are certain rules, both, kind of from film and TV, but also from my previous job, which was at Digital Ventures. Basically, we would work with BCG's kind of large corporate clients to build new kind of disruptive technology products and businesses. And so like
Mm.
there was often like a leap of faith that you'd have to take in terms of like this thing has value potentially. Let's figure it out, like that kind of thing. So
Mm.
how do you tell that story effectively?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And tell me about your you have an interest in, the immigrant story, like you were saying, you've moved around a lot, and that you try to put that kind of narrative maybe into your stories. What do you think's interesting about the immigrant story?
Um, I mean, again, I've been an immigrant from a lot of different places to a lot of different places, right? Like
Yeah.
around so much, but I've I think the kind of most conventional thing that people think of when they think of an immigrant story is usually one of immense hardship and sadness.
Hmm.
It's like the kind of movie or book that's work. It's an important film, but you have to watch it, and nobody actually
Yes.
wants to watch it. Whereas the immigrant stories that I know, there are many immigrant stories like that, but like the immigrant stories that I know are quite different in many cases. And
Like Celebration, for example.
yeah, and a celebration. It's not like hardship's not involved, but they're incredibly exciting, and the dynamic is really different, right? Like the
Mm.
dynamic is more about like what that immigrant brings to the table, and how
Hmm.
in like in a fair field, or in like a in an on an even field, that immigrant brings something that initially might seem like a disadvantage, but turns out to be an immense advantage, or like differentiating, or whatever. So
Hmm.
yeah, I like telling stories about otherness in general, right? Like
Hmm.
I feel like I've sort of always been a little bit strange in most of the in most of the circles that I've been, like a little bit of an odd fit, square peg, round hole kind of thing. And that's happened over and over again. Like I started out
Yeah.
working in technology at a bank, and I'm an engineer, but like I definitely did not fit in at a bank. And then I went and got an MBA, which is the safest way to like transition into what I thought was going to be the entertainment industry. And then
Mm.
for entirely economic reasons, because I made a habit of graduating into financial crises. And so like 2000, my MBA was during 2008, 2009. And, going into the film business was just not a realistic financial proposition. And so I went
Yeah.
into consulting instead. And then after a couple of years of being the only consultant with a ponytail, we started having discussions about building this new business, which would be designers and technologists and engineers, and like a lot more people like me. And so I found like a version of the job that I was doing that I was really excited about. And so I was able
Mm.
to shape it in that suddenly a lot of the things that were disadvantages became big advantages.
Yeah.
And and then again, even now, this near shift that I've done with moving into filmmaking and animation, a lot of I don't I didn't grow up in this industry. I've not been classically educated. I didn't go to school for any of this, but I find many of the things that I learned in my previous lives, like kind of the organization, delivery orientedness, like all of that kind of stuff, being big advantages. And
Mm.
so that otherness is sort of inherent to the immigrant experience.
Yeah.
I think it's probably telling that I live in New York. Like this is a place where everybody's an immigrant.
Yeah.
Like you walk down the street. I love the fact that you walk 3 blocks and you hear 5 languages.
Mm.
It's so invigorating for me. And
Rich.
so
Yeah.
yeah, and you're constantly being bombarded by looking at the same problem from multiple perspectives, which I find
Mhm.
intellectually very stimulating. And I
Yep.
think a lot of the best stories force you to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I feel like there's a lot of metaphors where I guess we think of like an immigrant story is about people moving countries, but like you said, you can also feel otherness in different ways. Like you can move in different professions, and you can feel similarly. So I think what's great about storytelling when you're telling stories, people who maybe haven't necessarily experienced that much themselves can imagine it can imagine the otherness feeling, and maybe then empathize with people, who come from either a different country or a different, situation. And like I grew up in London, around people, all my friends were all from different countries. All of our parents,
Yeah.
came from different countries, and the richness of that experience, was so invaluable. And, a lot of people don't get that opportunity. You live in
Absolutely.
places where there's not a lot of diversity. So I think it's cool. And like, do you feel like you want to represent different kind of characters in your stories for that reason?
Yeah, I think there's been a big kind of in the last several years, since 2020, there's an enormous kind of reckoning, and in the US specifically, right? There's an enormous sort of racial reckoning. And I think the nature of media has changed fundamentally, right? Like there's a lot
Mm.
more representation. And just taking the very narrow space of like animated content as an example of that, I think that's one place where that's happened to a very large extent. Things like the Spider-Verse is one of the most successful animated
Mm.
properties of all time. And you see diverse stories being told quite a lot more than more traditional media content. And I think that shift is certainly happening. But I think I certainly do want to tell stories like that, and that kind of provide different perspectives and different versions of those stories than I've seen before. Uh,
Hmm.
I like, bringing things to animation that haven't traditionally been seen in animation. Like a lot of like a more filmmaking, like live action filmmaking perspective, and
Yeah.
like maturity of themes and content like that, like stories which aren't traditionally told, like the kinds of stuff that I love. Like the more mainstream kinds of things that I love are, like Arcane on Netflix, or like Love, Death, and Robots. I love anthology series
Hmm.
because they, it's short film is obviously something I'm passionate about, but the anthology series, like, it allows such a bunch of different smaller stories being told, and it's like a short story kind of thing, right? Like it
Yeah.
allows you to have a mental exercise of like, take this perspective for 14 minutes or 6 minutes or whatever, and then and then after that move on to something completely radically different. And
Yeah.
so I enjoy content like that. So a lot of the stuff that I have planned further down the road is like that. This goes back to like the kind of artistic and technical learning curve. Some of the stuff that I have planned is just way too complex for what I know my abilities to deliver are right now. And
Hmm.
so I'm holding off on some of those and telling much simpler stories for the first couple of things that I put out.
Hmm.
I'm trying to layer on the technical and artistic complexity as I go. So like
Yeah.
starting out with something that, like the thing I'm making right now, is a single human character. All the others are robots, so the animation is much simpler for the robots. Um, the kind of visual style, like I love non-photorealistic rendering and like
Yeah.
painterly styles. This one's pretty conventional, like kind of standard CGI sort of look. And so I'm trying to layer those things on both the technical components, but also the narrative complexity, and the
True.
kind of more important themes that I have in mind. I'm trying to layer those on as I go. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
What do you like doing in animation that you can't do, like with live action?
Um, I mean, the from a solo animator's perspective, like the most powerful thing is I don't have to organize 30 people to
Yep.
set up a shoot, and I can reshoot things as much as I want. So like there's a pure logistics appeal to it, for like what I
Sure.
can the resources that I'm bringing to the table. There's a pure
Yep.
logistics component to it that's obviously very appealing. But beyond that, there's this enormous kind of stylistic range of choice that exists that allows you to do things visually that all contribute to the story. So, like,
Yeah.
everything from the design of the characters to the way that you shoot them to the way that they move to all of those things can and should inform the story. And in a well-made piece of animation, like all of those
Mm.
things are intentional and thought out, and they're all kind of different per character, and they all kind of, whether consciously or subconsciously, they all kind of tell the audience certain things.
Mhm.
And so a lot of that stuff is very hard to control in live action, and
Mhm.
especially there's the kind of old adage about how a film is made three times. It's made first when it's written, it's made second when it's shot, and it's made third when it's edited. And
Yeah.
like that's very true. Like I found, when I've been trying to make films for a very long time. I used to do short films when I was in college, and then in business
Yeah.
school, I went to Stern because because the film school was right, because NYU
Right.
school was right next door.
You could just
And
creep
so I
into
used
the
to make,
lectures.
yeah, I used to like do audit stuff, but also make short films with filmmakers at the film school and stuff like that. But every time I've edited something, you find the story is slightly different.
Hmm.
It's slightly different from what you thought of when you wrote it and everything else. So it's very true. And so when you're animating, the ability to just go back and like redo something slightly is
Hmm.
so powerful. Like it makes
Yeah.
it's such a difference to being able to make something cohesive. And like you talk to a live action filmmaker and they're like, well, we just didn't have that shot. So we had to cut out that thing just wasn't working. So we had to cut out that entire subplot. And
Mm.
I really wish that we could have had it, but you know,
Yeah.
so you never have that problem, you know.
Yeah.
And so there's that, but the the ability to like design a character's entire look and
This
the
is what I was thinking. Stylistically, yeah.
it's incredible, right? Like
Yeah.
so we're talking about I work in Unreal Engine and
Mm.
the Unreal sort of digital human platform is the metahumans, right? And so in a lot of
Mm.
ArcViz stuff, you'll see metahumans there. The aesthetic
Yeah.
of your default metahumans is very realistic, right? Like it's a very sort of generic digital human, super realistic in stills, but like in keyframed animation falls way into like uncanny valley
Yeah.
territory, right?
Hmm.
And so I've never been super interested in very realistic animation, mainly because is for my money, if you're going to make something that looks hyper realistic, just shoot it in live action or make it virtual production or something like that. But if you're going to make something completely animated, then design those characters to strengthen your story and to underline those things. And so,
Mm.
what I was saying earlier about for example, the factory worker engineer character not being scary enough, like the model I was using was just too cute. And like when I was animating him, it was just it was not coming off scary enough. It was just simply
You were
not.
falling in love with the character and you
Yeah,
realized you
it was
shouldn't.
just too sympathetic, and so I completely redesigned him from the ground up. I don't know if you do this. I can pull up the Unreal Engine file if you want and just
Sure,
show
yeah, you can
you.
share the file. You can share the screen
Yeah,
if you
I'll
want
share
to.
screen. I'll start it up and then when it loads, because it might take a minute to call this out. But I can show you the characters. But it is one of those things that you have such control over the look of the character. I
Hmm.
mean, in live action, the equivalent is casting, right? Like you cast someone
Hmm.
like Willem Dafoe because people think he's a villain. Like he just
Yeah.
looks like a screen villain, and so you
Yep.
can take that, but like crank it up to 11 in animation because you can design all
Hmm.
that, and that's one part of it. Then the way that character moves is also a way of emphasizing that, which live action you can do a certain amount of, but you can really emphasize it in animation. Like if you think
Yeah.
about Jungle Book, like the old school Disney animated Jungle Book,
Hmm.
my favorite films of all time, and
Yeah.
the way that Shere Khan, who's the villain, the tiger, the way that that character moves
Oh, yes.
such supreme confidence. Like there's the cat-like movement, which is semi-realistic, but that character is such supreme confidence with every move that they make. It tells
Mm.
you who they are without them saying a word, right? And
Yeah.
the voice, when it comes on, has got like that kind of sharp blade embedded in treacle and honey sort of thing that all the best villains have. And of course, it's a British accent, which also all the best villains have. But the way that character is designed from the ground up to create a feeling of dread and danger and unpredictability when they're on screen, like it's very hard to do unless you're an incredibly talented actor. It's really difficult to do that on screen,
Mm.
and that's
Yeah.
also the kind of performance that you can find and layer on slowly, right? So you
Mm.
develop a kind of rough version of it, and then you're like, oh, if he did this, then they would add that
Yeah.
additional layer of menace and stuff like that. So it's one of those things you can find in the edit/animation phase,
Yeah.
which working in real time actually it really changes the way that works. Like it's so, because you're so fluid between the animation phase and the editing phase, you go back and
And
forth so much, and you never have to worry about render times. It's just, it's a very satisfying creative experience. Like
hmm
you're able to like experiment with things so much and do different kinds of takes and that type of stuff so much more than you would in a traditional thing where you knew, you'd have to do this and then hit render and wait several hours and then see if it
mm,
works. Like really limits the amount of iteration you can do. And
yeah.
so doing that kind of stuff in Unreal has been very exciting, very, very creatively satisfying.
Yeah. Tell me about the Unreal Fellowship in animation that you did in 2023. What is that fellowship? You explain it to me in person, but can you describe
Yeah,
what it
yeah,
is, what it
of course.
involves?
Yeah, so Epic, which is the company that makes Unreal Engine, I do not work for them, by the way. I'm talking in very glowing terms about Epic, but I wouldn't
Yeah,
mind
no, I
being
mean
sponsored
they're
by
not
them.
same
I'm
if they
not.
want to sponsor the podcast. I mean, I talk about them a lot. They're a big part of
Yeah,
our industry, right?
yeah, exactly. So I mean, so they've always been very supportive of indie artists. Like Tim Sweeney's philosophy has always been like, that they're a company built on the kind of goodwill of a lot of small artists that use their engine to build what ended up being successful games. And so I think they've done a good job in most cases of like trying to be very supportive of those artists. So the fellowship program is something they started several years ago, long before I started messing around with Unreal. But as a way of encouraging artists, all the way from like very cutting edge visual artists to people that work at bigger studios,
hmm
showing them the possibilities of working in Unreal, because like um, traditional pipelines are so hard to break at a big studio because you have a bunch of
hmm
artists that are trained in that way, and your deadlines are always so tight. Like the time to switch and risk involved is hard. And so like it's a fun way of like having the equivalent of like an artist residency where you get to experiment with this new tool
mm
under the guidance and tutelage of a lot of really experienced professionals that have been using it, both people from Epic who are actually working on the product, as well as artists that have been using it for a while to make cool stuff. And
So
so,
you get like a direct
yeah,
direct access to ask them questions, essentially.
yeah, yeah, it's a pretty intense program. It's only 3 weeks long, but like each
Mm.
day is solid, I don't know, 14, 16-hour days. Like there's like lecture sessions, which are all quite interactive, but also guest speaker sessions. They had like Oscar-winning animated filmmakers come in and talk to us about how they did this thing in Unreal, or they would have, like people in the industry, DreamWorks or whatever, that are incorporating Unreal into their pipelines and being really honest and open about what works and what doesn't, and like
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. And then the cohort itself, which I didn't grow up in this industry, and so for me, something I started feeling about halfway through my first year doing this was like the lack of community, like not having
Yeah.
beings that I could talk to about this stuff. And you can only Google so much about like, learn from YouTube and all that stuff. It's very powerful,
Yeah.
but at a certain point, you really need to ask a live human being who has done this before, like, how does this work? And for
Yeah.
me, that was the single biggest, like, I found my people kind of moment, because it was a
Yeah.
bunch of artists in a wide range of experience, like some real newbies like me, but a lot of people that have been animating for like 20 years, but were experimenting with Unreal for the first time. And from all the big studios as well, like DreamWorks, Pixar, all of that. So that was fantastic. I mean, that was like for me, just in terms of suddenly having a bunch of friends that I could ask that kind of stuff to, but
Yeah.
also, as someone that is still sort of, like I said, still not super comfortable calling myself an artist. People like that telling you your work is good is
Yeah.
immensely validating. And it's like, well, okay, if this person thinks my work is good, then I'm not crazy. Like,
Must be good. I have a question for you. What and this is an interesting question to me, like for most of my life. What would it take for you to be comfortable calling yourself an artist?
whoa, I don't know. I may never be comfortable calling myself an artist. I don't know. And I don't even know really why I put such a high bar on that necessarily. It's
Mm.
just, I don't know if I will ever be 100% artist. Just because so much of my brain is sort of pre-programmed engineer and
Hmm.
pre-programmed, like, I don't know, business person and that kind of
Hmm.
thing. So like I feel like artist is a sort of new personality that I'm allowing to develop now.
Hmm.
And I I don't know. I mean, like there's the kind of more conventional components of like you win some awards, and if it's a big enough award, maybe you get more comfortable with that. But it is I don't know. I think it's maybe more of a mindset, right? Like
Yeah.
it's if I'm
Like an
truly
identity, maybe.
yeah, an identity is a good way of saying it. Like maybe it's a when I like truly allow myself to be like, this is not a product. This
Mm.
is a piece of art that stands on its own, and I don't really care what the interpretations are of it, which I'm definitely not there yet. Right. Like I definitely think of these things still to a certain extent as products that have to deliver and create a certain sort of impression that is the story that I'm trying to tell.
Yeah.
Because I'm doing something relatively simple. I think as I progress and do things that are significantly more complex, I will learn to like let go of that kind of singular nature of that interpretation. I'll
Yeah.
slowly start to let go of that, but I'm not there yet.
Do you know what's interesting? I found because I found that it's like a cultural thing. That word means different things in different cultures. Like I lived briefly in Spain,
Yeah,
where everyone called themselves an artist. Like you were kind of worked in a bank, you worked in a shop, you were a teacher, but you went home and made music. Everyone's an artist.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then I went to Germany. I was in Berlin, and if you call yourself an artist, there I found I think there is actually something with the word artist which kind of is like a very high compliment of yourself.
Mm,
Like if you go
yeah,
and have a really good meal, you say
right.
like that
The
chef is
work.
an artist.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. So when I would meet people and I said I was an artist, they all just looked at me like I was just saying that I'm a genius. And I realized no, you just gotta
Yeah.
say I make pictures, or I do paintings, or I'm a sculptor. I found the word artist is so loaded, and I had the same thing until many people, I think for me it was like if it's in my job title, then technically I could say that I'm an artist. But even then, it's very
Yeah.
uncomfortable. But I'm so interested in why people find it uncomfortable.
That's fascinating. I think that's such a great insight. Again, born from like living in different places and having seen different things, but like
Yeah.
yeah, that's fascinating. I completely agree because I do place a very high bar on the word
Yeah.
artist, whether it's it's not necessarily quality related, but it's like
Yeah.
it's an identity, it's a mindset. I think the
Yeah.
way is exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also feel like I mean it might go hand in hand if you're very like maybe you identify or like you're an overachiever, and if you have this high bar for your work, then being able to call yourself this thing that you like didn't identify as before, like it's sort of you feel like you haven't broken through. I think to like anyone who would watch your animations will say you're an incredible artist. So
That's
I
very
must
good.
say. um did you have it on screen, the thing you wanted to share, or is it still loading?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's loaded up. Here, I'll show you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the environment, right? The entire story takes place in this factory environment, which,
Mhm.
like in Unreal, the nice thing is you can take bits and pieces of a lot of different components and kit bash them together. Uh,
Mhm.
but should I explain the term kit bashing? It's a
I think people can look it up. I
Yes.
understand it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. But it's essentially a kit bashed environment. It's like put together.
Yeah.
But we were talking about the characters, right? And so like this this is the new design for like the
Oh,
antagonist
yeah.
character, and he's properly scary, right? Like he's very intimidating. And like these are the robots who are a lot cuter, and I've definitely
Oh,
off Wally's facial
yeah.
design here. But like that, this is what they look like now. Whereas previously the robots were a little too sinister looking, and
Hmm.
her character was, much cuter and rounder and like looked
Yeah.
like it was constantly in danger of being. being eviscerated. Whereas, whereas this guy looks like he could deal out some damage, and
Yeah.
so like that's
Inter
it.
That's cool. I can't wait to see this film. I mean, I love the concept and
Thanks.
yeah, I mean, it looks like the environment probably took a really long time to make. Although the kit bashing, so to explain it, kit bashing is when you have a bunch of parts that you put together, right?
Yeah, exactly. From a lot of different kits, and then you can retexture, recolor, rebuild, and like mix things. It's like remixing music. You take bits and pieces together and make them all kind of fit the singular vision that you have. So these were all sort of
Yeah.
different colors, and like they're from about 10 different kits for entirely different things. Like the industrial robots themselves are all from a completely different kit, and the kind of these guys, the kind of control robots I built from scratch, like from bits and pieces. So there's a
Mhm.
yeah, so it's a pretty wide range,
Amazing.
like that. Yeah,
Great. I'm gonna have just I have a closing question I'd love to ask you.
yeah,
What kind of films would you love to see from the next generation of filmmakers?
yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of like I feel like people in general are tend to be pretty cynical about where Hollywood and filmmaking and that kind of thing is right now,
Mhm.
just because there's so much like IP regurgitation going on. Like if something
Mhm.
doesn't, if you're in sort of, if you're trying to get like a series or a film funded, like the thing you're constantly being like, yeah, well, what IP can you hang it to? Like, can you make this a Marvel story or a Star Wars story or whatever? Like,
Uh,
you know, like
yeah.
a lot of there's a lot of that going on. I think that the cynicism around that production type constraint trickles through to the audience as well. Like people get a little bit cynical about like, well, you know, it's another thing from this giant corporation. Really, what they're trying to do is sell me on some bullshit. And
Yeah.
so, but I think the thing that really excites me about where the industry is heading is there's been this immense democratization of the ability to create really high quality content and
Yeah.
Unreal virtual production, like all of this, like this was not possible 5 years ago. Like what I'm doing
Yeah.
right now was not possible. When I took my sabbatical in 2020 to kind of like figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, experimenting in real time, I tried with Unity first and then switched to Unreal. But like working in real time felt like having a superpower compared to any version of animation I'd ever done before. And
Yeah.
that was the thing that really convinced me that I could do this, that this was even remotely practical. And like I probably wouldn't have quit if it wasn't for that. And so
Mhm.
the fact that the production of really high quality content is being democratized to such a large extent means that I think we're on the cusp of a revolution of like seeing really interesting stuff, high quality stuff come out of the very indie world. Like if you think about what happened with video, like Soderbergh making, I don't know, 5 films a year on
Mhm.
video, low budget, but like really pushing the envelope of what was possible with feature film. I think we're starting to see that happen with animation
Yeah.
because these tools are becoming like one person, two people, like a team of 5 can make a feature quality film. Like virtual production and Unreal is like one part of it, but also mocap and AI type stuff. All of that kind of thing is like completely changing the way pipelines work. And if you're a small team, you can make something very impressive relatively quickly in a way that just wasn't possible. And so
Mhm.
that's what I'm most excited about. I'm excited to kind of be watching that and to be on, I don't know about the forefront, but like riding the wave certainly of
Yeah.
that occurring.
Yeah.
And you know, I think that the future of that particular space is really bright. Like animation has been in the US, it's a very sort of kid oriented, like child oriented thing. But in Europe, animation is a very broad spectrum, all
Yeah.
ages kind of thing. It's a, you know, the animation nerd in me is like, it's a medium, it's not a genre. But it is, right? Like it is a way
Yeah.
of stories. It's
Telling a story.
fundamentally
Yeah.
different from live action in like a lot of the ways that you were talking about. And I'm excited to see where that goes in the next 5 to 10 years because I think it's going to fundamentally change.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And like getting, more young artists or artists of any level of experience feeling like they can, give it a go. we're
Yeah, the
going to
fact that I
produce.
can make something that looks like this is
Yeah.
ludicrous, right? Like, I have, I've gone to a couple of schools and things like that, but I have not studied this properly, right? Like, I'm largely
Anthony, you're just an artist. I think that's why I think when you identify, the sooner you identify, the better you'll understand yourself.
that's very nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I feel like I could carry on talking to you, and we're gonna have to get you on again at some
Sure, of
point
course.
and ask a million more questions. But yeah, and I'm gonna put up a link to your animations that you have online and anything else that you want to show people. And people should definitely go and check out your work.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I feel like it was part of it was talking about it was also therapy, like a little bit
Yeah,
of it, which is great. So
yeah.
really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for
I think
having
many people are going to watch and actually identify, like, I totally understand what he means, and maybe everyone will quit their day jobs and become artists. I love it.
me. I mean,
Thank you,
talk,
Anthony.
talk about an aspirational world. That'd be great. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.